Okay, good afternoon. We hope you had good lunch and are ready to go through the afternoon sessions. Okay, so I have to say that I was not actually to moderate this session. It was to be Vladimir Kostić, our well-known doctor and former president of the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, but due to objective reasons, he could not be here with us today, so I was asked to fill in. So the title of this session is Contributions of Arts to Sustainability. So we will continue or go back from, I'm now thinking of the previous sessions, to listening and hearing about actually literary art from our presenters, who are well-known writers, journalists, poets, depending who. Just to mention that Vesna Goldsworthy will be the first speaker, as in the program, Maja Herman Sekulić the second, Mario Petrucci the third, and the fourth will be Anni Kumari, who is not sitting here, but will be speaking online. So, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much.
So Vesna, please proceed. Vesna Goldsworthy is from the Department of English and Creative Writing, University of Exeter, UK. School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing, University of East Anglia, Norwich. The title of her speech is Iron Curtain, the novel as an analytic form.
Thank you so much, Vesna. I hope everyone can hear me. In fact, I'm no longer at the University of East Anglia. I've become an emerita there, so if you email me there, you can find me on the internet, but I only visit that email once a month, so don't expect a quick reply. So it is a huge pleasure to be at the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences today, and it makes me think of its British equivalent. There is no British equivalent to Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences. Indeed, there is no one academy as such. And in some ways, this is very telling for our topic here today and yesterday. In 2021, I was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, which is the literature equivalent of this august institution. And there is a very intricate ceremony of acceptance where you sign your name on a roll of parchment, which begins with Byron and his signature and carries on to much less august writers, such as myself. We have a choice of pens with which to sign the parchment. There's Byron's quill, there's Charles Dickens's pen, T.S. Eliot, George Eliot, etc., etc. I chose Byron because of the Balkans and Greece and because he died here in the region. But I thought today, what about Ada Lovelace or Alexander Fleming? Why not their pens? The real interconnection of art and literature would be that. The society, the Royal Society, which is the equivalent of the Science Academy, is in a completely different building. We never meet them. It was established in 1660, and while we are the Royal Society of Literature, they're just the Royal Society because it's the science that has the primacy there. And you notice the Royal Society, it's a bit like the American World Wide Web, the only country that doesn't have a national designation in its address. Just as Britain in the 19th century, when it was still the world leader, had the only stamps, postal stamps in the world that didn't have a country written on it. So this is, the Royal Society is the default, the Royal Society of Literature are the entertainers. Indeed, when I was invited by Nebojša to participate in this conference, I assumed that I would be the entertainment and that I wouldn't understand any of the scientific papers presented here. I'm quite used to it. I don't mind being the entertainment for what is worth. I presented my books at Davos to the economists I presented them to very varied audiences. But it is a real pleasure to be truly inter- and transdisciplinary here. And I was most impressed by the paper by Professor Jung this morning, speaking about transdisciplinarity, transboundary, transclass, and translinguality. I think we should really aim for that, not just here, but elsewhere too. And by trans, I really mean the interconnections, interdisciplinarity is speaking to each other, and transdisciplinarity is working truly. I'm also particularly interested in translingual writing, because a couple of my books were written translingually, and in Serbian, which is my mother tongue, and in English, which is my third language, and I have experienced some of the difficulties of translingual writing, not in terms of writing, it is a joy, but in terms of having your books published translingually, such as not having an original. The system is set up to have an original language and a translation. If you write translingually and say they're both originals, well, good luck persuading the ISBN people to give you two independent ISBNs. The National Library here in Serbia bent to my demands. The British Library was unwilling to listen. So you have one original and one semi-original. But actually, I won prizes for that book in Britain, so perhaps that is an equal. Now, I have there in the title of my paper the idea of novel writing as an investigative form. What I mean by that, in the British university system, about every 6 years, we are subject to an audit of our research. When I started my academic career, I was teaching Victorian literature, and that was easy, because the notion of research, their publication, citation, is very straightforward. But once you start writing creatively, it becomes more difficult. Quite a lot of those accounts of my research are the best pieces of fiction that I've ever written, because you have to make it up. What is research in a novel? So there is the idea of research, which I will give you as examples in 3 of my books very quickly. So my novel Gorski, which was serialized by the BBC in 2015, is a reworking of Great Gatsby, but with Russians in London. So my research was twofold. One was the language of Fitzgerald, the structure of the novel, the idea of translating it, and I mean translating in that original medieval dimension. You know, translation originally means carrying the bones over. So I was carrying Fitzgerald's bones over to Britain and putting them in a Russian skin. So there was literary research. There was also social research. Social research for Gorski was much more fun, because once the oligarchs in London realized that I'm not political, they gave me unprecedented access. So I had the joy of flying in a helicopter above my university, just to see what it looks like above. I had the joy of flying in a private plane, looking at various villas that I normally don't have access to, including sliding down a slide from a bedroom of a wife of one of those oligarchs to the subterranean swimming pool in the same building. So that's nice research, right? They're now no longer in London, so the research was timely as far as that was concerned. My second novel, Monsieur K, was set in London in 1947, and there the research was linguistic, because I was writing in English as spoken in 1947. You don't think that the language changes, but it does enormously. Just a tiny example. I needed the word for ghostwriter. It didn't exist in 1947 in Britain. It existed in America from about 1930s. So actually, like Houdini, I shackled myself in order to create this new form. And that linguistic research was fantastic. The other side of the research was London in 1947. And there, I had the joy of internet. Where were the bomb sites? Where were the restaurants? Where were, if there was a concert in my novel, you could absolutely be sure there was a real concert with a real program on the real day in 1947. It was the coldest winter on record, so I switched the heating off in my study for about 3 months. It wasn't quite the same, but I also had calendars from 1947 to keep track of dates. So this is factual research and formal research, good examples. With Iron Curtain, by the way, I also wrote a memoir back in the day, and you would be surprised to hear that for a memoir you also need to do a lot of research, such as contacting your friends to make sure that the dates tally and that you're not too free with the form. But with the last novel, about which I'm about to speak, that is Iron Curtain, it was very interesting because I approached this project the way you would approach a doctoral thesis. I did doctoral thesis many decades ago, so this was refreshing, going back to that. By which I mean, I had a hypothesis. The novel was published in 2023 to fantastic reception. If you have the time to Google my name, I should, because it was the best book of the New Yorker for 2023, there's a lovely feature about it. I couldn't speak as well about it as the people who are funded by the New Yorker. They have more money and more time to think about it. So what I did with this particular novel is I started with the hypothesis that I will write a novel which will compare East and West. The novel is set in 1986, so the dog days of the Cold War, but with the frame, which is the framing story, which is in 1991 in Berlin, where one of the main characters is speaking. So you have what we call a dramatic irony, that throughout the novel, you know that the world I'm describing is about to change. Or, if you remember Francis Fukuyama, in the novel, it was the end of history. But outside the novel, history goes on much more messily than before. So my hypothesis for the novel, or my research frame, was to make a comparison between East and West in a set of questions. So the first question I asked myself, and here I'm speaking as someone who's lived in the United Kingdom for 40 years, so much longer in the West than in the East, but I'm still very much an Eastern woman by mentality. So the first thing that I compared is the notion of fate. The notion of fate, how does an individual look at their own life in terms of what happens to them? Here, and I don't want to be essentialist, but just as a working proposition, we believe in fate. If something is written to you, it will happen sooner or later. The way it is in ancient Greek tragedies, you know, however much Oedipus tries to avoid falling in love with a particular person, he still does, and the penalties, the hubris is there. And in the West, at least nominally, people believe that you create your own fate. So that even in the American Declaration of Independence, you have the right to pursue your own happiness. You indulge in self-improvement. My students believe in something that is described as manifesting. I don't know if you know what that is, which is that if you imagine a Ferrari and think very hard, you will eventually get it in front of your house. A lot of people who write about self-improvement create bestsellers, unlike my books, because they sell that particular ideology. Probably both of those ideas of faith are bad for you, bad for us here, because we tend not to put seatbelts on because our lives are in the hands of a higher power. Bad for people in the West because they believe that they are to blame if they don't succeed, whereas they are shackled by the society, and it's a kind of whitewash to think that you can do whatever you want so long as you read enough self-help. So the notion of destiny was one of my questions. The notion of freedom. What is individual freedom? My main character is the daughter Milena, the daughter of a highly placed communist leader, and she has all the privileges. She has no freedom as we understand it in the West, because we are talking about the Cold War. She's being observed. She's not allowed to go wherever she wants, but she has every privilege you could imagine, including, and I remember some of those things from my own youth here in Yugoslavia, because I lived in a very privileged part of town. The best houses, the best beaches. I had access to the kind of beach in the Adriatic that, I don't know, Bill Gates might be able to afford, but most middle-class people would not. It is the space that you get when you have the privilege, yes, the space. In the West, the notion of individual freedom was something that I explored in the second part of the novel, which is set in England, where my character discovers that that individual freedom is not what it seems to be. Now, I could give a lecture about that, but I won't. I will ask you to read the novel if you're interested. But one thing that I would like to talk about is... 5 minutes. Okay. So, one thing that I would like to talk about is this Eastern European country in which the novel is set, and that is not a specific country, but a country that is a composite of all the Warsaw-Pact countries. I started from my first book, Inventing Ruritania, and the rather derogatory set of images of the Balkans that I found in British fiction. I was talking to someone yesterday about Dracula. So if you want to talk about vampires, I'm here, I'm your woman. I was talking about Ruritania, etc. So here, the novel writes back to the West by creating those composites, and in fact, it is the image of Britain that is more interesting. So, to conclude, to foreshorten my talk, when you think about literature and science and the research that we do in creative writing, the stereotype is that literature is here, or writing is here, to popularize science. But it works the other way too. Very often, the writers come up with big scientific discoveries or the concepts for them decades ahead. H.G. Wells in 1913, The World Set Free, directly influenced Leo Szilard's nuclear reactor. Defibrillator was first mentioned, not by name, but by concept, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And the idea actually originated from the novel. I like to think that my world of Ruritania, this imaginary Eastern European land, will one day turn out to be the real world composite East European, if not EU, then something else that is transnational, translingual, dignified, and free. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vesna. This was a very inspiring talk, telling about your own work, but also about the, well, relations, class, and other in different countries. Okay, now we will hear Maja, Herman Sekulić. She is the Vice President of the International Academy of Ethics in Chandigarh, India. Also Academy of American Poets, PEN America, Serbian PEN Center, Association of Writers of Serbia, and Serbian Literary Society. She will speak on the topic of the digital galaxy. Please, Maja.
Hello. I'm very honored to be in the National Academy of Arts and Sciences in Belgrade and to speak on the sustainability or survival of literature or arts in this digital world. I will start with the Charles Darwin quotation saying it is the one most responsive to change that survives, not the most intelligent, not the strongest. And I think that we are actually in this age the ones that will have to be responsive and to accept the change that is happening today. Referring to Scott Fitzgerald that Vesna was talking about, I had the privilege of living in the room where Scott Fitzgerald lived for a year at Princeton University, where I did my PhD. And I was wondering how come I have this enormous living room with a beautiful fireplace, and then I have this small, tiny bedroom, and I inquired and found out that this tiny room is for the butler. Well, we live in another world now. So anyway, in my book, in my novel, Looking for Lolita, that was recently published here too in Serbian, I start with the premise of is it possible to write the novel in this age? Because we we know more about Anna Karenina than about our mother. And would Anna Karenina commit suicide if she had, and Vronsky, if they had cell phones? You know? So as I was asking these questions that are crucial for understanding our digital galaxy, I was writing a novel. And that novel recently was awarded in Italy as the best foreign novel. So anyway, to go back to a digital galaxy, it's a book that a famous Italian intellectual who just wrote a book on my books, Mauro Montachiesi, who was ex-president of the Academy of Arts and Philosophy in Rome, said that it is not just a book, that it is a critical constellation where Borges meets Facebook, where poetry becomes an archive, where every pixel has a heart. And that I remind us over and over that the future is not something waiting to come along, but it is already here and it is rewriting us. It is very interesting actually to look at the very history of this little book, which Montachiesi calls the constellation, that 6 years have passed since the first edition of the digital galaxy, and another 6 since the second, and then there is a third one, and I still didn't change a word of it. In spite of all the new developments. I just added the last chapter in the English edition about the artificial intelligence. Namely, when I submitted the manuscript for the first edition of this book, sometime in the summer of 2011, my American publisher offered me a contract for the digital edition of my novel In Search of the Still King, which was printed in English in 2005. That novel is known to our readers under the title The Still King, Kralj Svile. So before the publication of Digital Galaxy in the fall of 2011, I became the first Serbian author whose book was published in an electronic edition, although in English. I was also the first writer from Serbia who experienced that their book became globally available in the true sense of the word, which is surely the most advantageous side of the electronic editions. Almost at the same time, I received a Kindle reader as a gift, which was useful for me during long trips. I could carry an entire library in the small board. Now I have a reader in my increasingly smarter phone. Despite that, my love for the printed book did not wane. On the contrary, it grew stronger. Now, with even greater pleasure, I hold the printed book in my hands as an artifact, as a piece of art in itself. For all fans of the printed world, and I think that all of us here are those fans, the fact that paper is back in use is important. After several years of seemingly unstoppable penetration of electronic books, their sales began to decline, while sales of printed books unexpectedly began to grow. According to the Association of American Publishers, which tracks more than 1,200 publishing houses, in 2015, digital book sales fell for about 10%, compared to the previous year, while the sales of printed and paperback editions increased by about 16%. This sounds quite optimistic for us. And interestingly enough, it seems that the generations who grew up on volumes of the Harry Potter saga or the Hunger Games trilogy are the ones that grew up on digital technology and now prefer paper to pixels. This is good news. And this is what I was trying to balance out in my book, Digital Galaxy. The negative and the positive of the digital age. One sec. So I went, as Vesna was saying, in every book I go deep into research. And I went to all the way back to Gutenberg Galaxy and find out that it wasn't easy even for him. Even Gutenberg's printing press was not well received everywhere, and its inventor died in misery and disappointment. His Bible was printed in only 180 copies. Only 5% of the literature printed in the 15th century represent the classics. Although Luther and Erasmus then count among best-selling writers. However, most of printed material represent pamphlets, almanacs, sensational and exciting news, trash, in short. Printing houses are corrupting innocent hearts, complains one of its first critics, contemporary of Gutenberg, the Benedictine Filippo de Strato. In the 15th century, another Italian critic feared that press would destroy serious thinking. Now that everyone can press whatever it wants, people write less and less about what is the best and all the more about what is fun. So that was the reception of the print in the 15th century. Let's go even further back. Socrates was also afraid of innovation. Literacy itself was not always welcome either. The biggest of all oral communicators, Socrates, was afraid that the new technology of the written word based on the alphabet would destroy thought, because it would allow people to easily remind themselves if they forget what they have learned. Even worse, the Greek thinker feared writing will make it impossible for ideas to flow freely and change in real time, in a way they do in our mind during oral exchanges. So you see that our fears were also a part of the acceptance or non-acceptance of the new technologies. So I would say that we have to always look at both sides and try, as Darwin said, to accept. So at the end, I added only this short note on the artificial intelligence, good or bad, I am asking. Without ethical culture, there is no salvation for humanity, wrote Albert Einstein. Now we live in an era of artificial intelligence, an outgrow or the youngest child of the digital galaxy. Does AI even know what ethics or ethical culture is? Chomsky, in trying to answer this question, quotes Borges, who wrote that if you live in a time of great change, you experience both comedy and tragedy and experience revelation in understanding yourself and the world. As with transition from Gutenberg to digital galaxy, I tried to show that we experience both negative and positive aspects of the big change. Positive because AI is used as means to solve many problems. Negative because we feel that AI can degrade our creativity and debase our ethics by using technology as a source of our knowledge and our language. But so far, all the Snapchats available today are more into quantity than into quality contents. Thus, Chomsky concludes, as we know from the science of linguistics and the philosophy of knowledge, they differ profoundly from how humans reason and use language, end of quote. In short, those AI chats cannot match human mind or human creativity because we rhyme and reason in a different way. We are, at our best, inherently ethical and original, often totally unpredictable in creating ideas, philosophy, literature, and arts that become once again saviors of humanism, of ethics, and thus of humanity. At the end, I just want to say that very recently, Indian philosopher and writer Dr. Janil Anand asked me to write a blurb for his latest book, which I did with pleasure. I was very inspired. I dared to put his epics into the genre of le fantastique, the fantasy literature and so on. And then to test this blurb, which was more than a blurb, it was more like an introduction, he put it in the Grok chat. Grok is invented by, it's a child of Elon Musk that he likes to use. And Grok gave me flying marks. Grok said that this originality and sharpness of mind he cannot match. So I'm very, very honored and flattered by this. So we can all look forward to the new chapter in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Maja. Yes, a very relevant theme about which much was spoken, but this was from a very specific perspective of a writer, and a writer who pays a lot of attention to ethics as well. Okay, so now we will hear Mario Petrucci. His affiliation is in the Royal Literary Fund, London, UK, then Oxford Brookes University, University of Westminster from London, Brunel University of London, City and Guilds of London Art School, and Imperial War Museum, London. A lot of affiliations. Okay, so his talk is on art and sustainability, salvation and the unholy Trinity.
Thank you. That list just proves my promiscuity academically. Neboshka, thank you for you and your lovely family for this invitation, and to all the people outside who are quietly helping, the people who clean our rooms, who look after the streets, people who are not necessarily part of this but essential to it. I thank them on our behalf. I hope you'll indulge me with being able to tell you a funny story. It's about a Western woman who's lost in the Sahara, and she sees a glint in the sand, and she picks it up hoping for some help. And this is an inscription, so she rubs it. Out comes a genie. And the genie says, "I've been trapped in that lamp for 2,000 years. You freed me. I'm very powerful. I will grant you a wish." So she's about to say, "Well, give me money, give me material wealth." And she thinks, well, this is my opportunity to do something for humankind. So she says to the genie, "Can you sort out war? We are a warlike species. Can you help us end wars?" So the genie looks in his crystal ball and he sees all the history of war, the ideology, and so on. And he says, "This is a very difficult job. I could try, but even my power might not be able to change this. Can you think of something more personal, closer to home?" So the woman says, "My husband has a difficult personality. Can you improve his personality just a little bit?" So the genie looks in his crystal ball and says, "This is your husband?" "Yes." "Let's have another look at war." I think you'll see the relevance of that story as my talk progresses. This should work. I'm holding it upside down. Is that working? Shall I use this? Yeah, that's it. There we go. Okay, good. We'll make a start. I have to say, on bad days, I do feel like this first picture about Gaia and our future, very pessimistic, quite angry, and I feel that many people discuss the environmental issue in this kind of finicky way. We're in a juggernaut rushing towards a cliff, fiercely contesting whether we're doing 105 or 95 miles per hour. But then on better days, I think, well, let's look at the causes. And perhaps if we look at the real reasons for this problem, we might have some help. And over 30 years, I think I've isolated at least 3 reasons. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but 3 ways in which we are unable to break through into eco-activity from eco-lethargy. And these are from various sources which I cite: bad memes, framed questions, and radical inertia. We'll take them one at a time. You all know about memes from Dawkins. There are bad ones and good ones. Cultural fragments that replicate and go through time, often mutating. So you remember, some of you, the song from the 60s and 70s, I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company, etc. And more recently, Donald Trump, drill baby drill. Very powerful slogans, phrases, extremely influential, very enduring and permanent. Then you have framed questions, an idea I developed from C.K. Hooker. Questions that have assumptions welded into them from the start. So they don't really invite open discussion. So shall we reserve 0.1 or 0.2% of GDP for sustainability? That's a closed question with very limited options for what might be alternatives to it. That's what I call a framed question. They're everywhere in politics, economics, and in literature. Then there's radical inertia from the wonderful Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich, who wrote a great book called Deschooling Society. He didn't believe in the medical profession or in schools, and he had very powerful reasons for that. And this is my innovation of one of his ideas: a profound resistance to change, or huge momentum in a given direction that's very difficult to reverse. And you find this in fossil fuel dependency, mobile phone use, party politics, traditions, contracts. Everywhere you look, there's radical inertia. And it becomes radical when the alternatives are almost invisible. So, for example, I did try to find a way here that wasn't a flight. I just wasn't able to do it. With all the various obligations I have back in London, there was no way to get here without using a plane. So I have to accept this is a form of radical inertia. I don't really have that many options that are easy. Then I introduced 2 special cases of radical inertia: denial, and I was glad to hear it earlier today, addiction. Won't engage, can't disengage. 2 sides of the same coin, or won't start or can't stop. Addiction is a crucial matter in our efforts to change society. Not just will, but addiction. And there's a great paper by Marshall that looks at all the different kinds of denial, which is a form of addiction in reverse. And I won't go through these different examples, but responsibility and agency, I had no choice, I was following orders. Even reaction formation, doing the opposite. Actually, says the company, we're doing enough for the environment, we should do a bit less. Listen to some of Donald Trump's speeches. They sound very much like reaction formation. And then we can add various others: silence, projection, deflection, blaming, etc., as forms of denial. A classic example where the unholy Trinity, as I called it, applies is the idea of eternal economic growth. That's supported by persistent memes, the norms of economy, slogans, theory, etc., framed questions that target, for example, growth rates rather than whether or not growth or what kind of growth is desirable. And we've had people speak about that. And then, of course, radical inertia again, capitalism, business expectations, investment returns. Add to that addiction to fossil fuels and some places denial of climate change being there at all. you have an unholy recipe here for an inability to change, not even with all the will in the world, an inability to change on a grand scale. So I thought we'd take a moment just to think for ourselves in a moment's quiet. We stop 1 minute on the anniversary of the First World War. Let's stop 1 minute now and think of whether or not there's one thing we can bring to mind that affects us individually, personally, as individuals, that is maybe a meme that we've taken on board, or a framed question that we've internalized, or a form of radical inertia in our household or business or owning a car that we find very difficult to change, and see how that ripples outwards from you to your family, to your job, to your community, to the nation and the globe. Let's just take a moment. There should always be time for reflection, even when you're talking. So what is the role of art and poetry in addressing this inability for society, politics, economics to change fundamentally? And I have to add here that this is not the only way I think we can address this. I have various ideas in economics, society, politics, but I was asked to focus on art. So this is not the only way, this is just me focusing on one of the several strands, how one might approach this. So first of all, art addresses a different part of the brain. Cognitively, we know this. The way in which our brains internalize factual evidence, charts, diagrams, is different from the way we internalize stories and rhetoric. But it probably needs to be great art, not state art. We all know about the limitations of state-funded art and where that leads. Another way from Russian formalism, a literary theory, is defamiliarization, where the art makes the unexamined assumption more visible, more strange, more itself. And in that way, framed questions are opened up, memes are exposed, and with everything going the wrong way in terms of attention spans and so on, defamiliarization helps you to spend longer in your perception, to take a little longer to take something in. And that seems to me vitally important in education, which is why we should use art in education. It makes things take longer rather than shorter. Also, plurality in art. It's very difficult with good art, such as someone like Picasso, to have just one view that everyone agrees on. So it's already meme-proofed. You can't have an official view of a piece of art. It's interpreted individually, locally, regionally, and so on. So that's great. But I have to add that sometimes good memes help us, but we have to be aware of good memes. If we spread good memes, they're out of our control. They can warp, modify, evolve into bad ones. An example of that would be poetry in the First World War. It was a good meme before the war started, and then it evolved into a pro-patriotic one, which encouraged young men to fight, and then it evolved again through Wilfred Owen into a form to resist the First World War. So it kept changing. You can't control it. And finally, the idea of transformation. We talk about transdisciplinary, but there is also transformation. And Rainer Maria Rilke, in his 9th Elegy, talks, what is your most pressing injunction, if not for transformation? And I mentioned how the First World War brought that about. And then finally, great art reboots consciousness. Reboots consciousness. Radical inertia meets a powerful force of a radical impact. When we deeply change our mind, think of Rachel Carson's book way back in the 60s, how that changed an entire generation's perception of the environment. But it has to be compelling. Otherwise, as Woody Allen said, life doesn't imitate art, it imitates bad TV. So all of those and more perhaps help to make unsustainable systems, which are forms of institutionalized habit, less so. less vulnerable to denial and addiction and the various forms of radical inertia. As Ernst Fischer said, art must show the world as changeable and help to change it. So what kinds of art might work in this regard? Well, there's indigenous Aboriginal art, which is grounded, has proof of time behind it. You have the avant-garde, which challenges your perception and enriches it. And then you've got two different forms of environmental art, one which is under the same banner. One is simply art that addresses the environment in any way, and another more richly involves itself in the environment, becomes part of it, and becomes an installatory form. And that can be very productive. But before I finish, I'm moving towards the end quickly now, I wanted to ask a question, an unframed question. What is sustainability? Is it itself vulnerable to unhelpful means like monocultural plantations that are sustainable but don't have any diversity? Is it subject to framed questions like how do we measure the value of a forest, which is normally called an intangible in economics? It's not even real, it's intangible. And how do we get around the radically inert aspects of sustainability? Organisations that can't change their perception of sustainability, as happened with the Brunel report. Have we taken time to be careful about what we mean exactly by sustainable development, needs, equity? So, have we assumed that if we just say the word sustainability, we become immune to the unholy Trinity? Of course not. We may be vulnerable to our own forms of denial and addiction, entrapped even within that positive term. So it's just a side issue, but an important one. How have we defined this? Have we taken the time to do that? So 3 suggestions for change. Denise Levertov, the American poet, said, "The poets, all artists, must give us an imagination of peace to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster." We have to have a positive aspect to art, not just doom and gloom. The research shows that warnings and negative feedback are less effective in mobilising change than a positive vision that you're guided towards and encouraged to take up. Then, of course, as Jean Sibelius wrote, you must choose businessmen to talk to because artists only talk about money. So please, fund your artists. We're struggling out here. Most of us have 2 or 3 jobs to support our art. We're not in the economic system. We don't want to be in the economic system, but funding artists is crucial to keep this area of activity alive. And the third one, perhaps the most important, is addressing the problem of radical inertia of unsustainable socio-economic global systems that find it very difficult to change and resist, actively resist any change in influence. And that's perhaps the biggest problem of all. And where can art help us in this? It can help us say that measurement is much more than, observation and attention is much more than measurement, that our values are much more than prices, that our understanding and wisdom is much more than data and statistics, and our responses to a situation extend beyond policy and law. That's not to say that anything on the right-hand side lacks value. Of course, they're important, but it has to be couched within a bigger addressing of the larger issues, the more vital issues. And if we can do that, then we find ourselves resting in a more original form of ecology, which is relationship, empathy, and human sensibility. And that might change what seem to be unsustainable systems that endure. Seems like this system doesn't want to change. Here we go. My final idea is when people say, well, how do we do this then? What works? This is just a suggestion. What system on our planet has survived through change all the chaoses and crises of meteorite impacts, volcanic activity? It's Gaia itself, it's the environment itself. We can look to the environment for ideas, and this stretches from the pragmatic, the fact that the environment can glaze at room temperature, create enamel at room temperature. Think of your own teeth, think of seashells. We have to build kilns. From the pragmatic all the way up to the metaphysical, ecology has already answered many of the questions we're asking. And maybe one way to address this is to spend some time with ecology, to spend some time in the environment, to observe it as scientists, to observe it as economics, and to observe it as human beings. And I'd like to finish with one example of this, a very short poem that takes 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. I've been thinking a lot about energy, whose unit in science is the joule. I'm a PhD physicist, by the way. I've gone into schools to teach energy as an economist, as a scientist, as a pragmatist, as a political agitator. Those methodologies don't always work. I wondered if art might shed light on what energy is, or what it can be. And orders of magnitude is the scale at which energy works. So this poem begins with very large amounts of energy and scales it down and comes to its own conclusion. And I'll let the poem have the last word, which is much more resonant than my own. Is this rebooting consciousness for you? Not yet
Orders
finished.
of magnitude.
Not quite.
100,000 trillion joules to turn an ice cap into mush. 100,000 billion joules to erase a major eastern city. 100,000 million joules to run a car to death. 100 million of the same for fire brigades to reach the kitten. 10 million just to keep December from cold feet. 100,000 joules for a mug of tea, 100 joules for a second's worth of war and peace, 10 to raise a hand, to lift an average apple to the lips, a single joule to shout the command, half a joule to pull the trigger, just 1/10 to push the button, almost 0 to have the thought.
No. Great, thank you so much for bringing these important aspects of our inertia primarily, and also for giving us a poem. So now we have the last speaker. This is Anni Kumari. She will be performing online. She's from the Department of Visual Arts, Ashoka University, Sonipat, India. And her speech is Spirals, the Structural and the Spectacular Across Mathematics and Painting. Hello.
Hello, I don't know if I can be heard or am seen.
We hear you.
Okay. And so, good evening, everyone. I'm joining from a different part of the world. Unfortunately, I could not be there for the conference in person, but I'm joining virtually. I'm very enthralled by all the speakers, and the points that they've said before me kind of have a resonance with what I'm just going to be laying out over here, right? So it's a very, very interesting moment for me to be a part of this conference, and I'm immensely grateful to Mr. Nebosa and the World Academy of Art and Science for this exhilarating and for this wonderful opportunity. So now let me start with a very simple question, and this is a question that I get asked all the time. And the question being very simple: what do you do for a living? Well, this is definitely a question that all of us get asked, and we ask others all the time. And we ask like irrespective of thinking anything. So there's absolutely nothing unusual about it, except that the moment I reply, I'm an artist, I paint. That's the moment when that person usually first stares at me and then looks and then says, no, I mean, what do you do as a profession? And I say exactly the same thing, except in a different tone. I say, I paint, I'm an artist. And then what follows after that is a series of questions that go like, oh, wow, but is it sustainable? Like, can you survive as an artist in a metropolitan like Delhi, which is where I live and work mostly? And they go like, then how do you support yourself financially? Do people actually buy your work? Is there like a good market for artwork? Is there like a future for painting now that there are all kinds of technology, including AI, for generating visuals? And one of the speakers also talked about the impact of AI and the correlation between AI and how it can't replace ethics. And so usually what I have to say to all of these questions is this one-liner which I say, and I say it depends on how you approach it. For me, what is most interesting here is that how people think of sustainability purely in terms of economics, finance and commerce, and not so much in terms of the value and the power of aesthetics, of innovative ideas, processes, practices, and policies, all of these important things that have a profound impact on the quality of our lives. And in that logic, all of the arts is then reduced to production and commerce. In addition to my practice, I also design and teach visual art courses at the university and as part of various undergraduate programs for students from various disciplines of art and science. And over the years, what I have seen is that there has been a growing interest among students, especially those majoring in psychology, anthropology, biology, and even mathematics, to know more about art history, cultural practices, curatorial studies, and visual art practices. And what I have noticed that often towards the end of my course, when I ask my students whether they would like to pursue visual arts for higher studies or as a career option, most students would just keep looking at me and would smile and then would politely say no. And I totally get it when this no comes from those whom I know had taken it up just for a change or a break from the usual stuff, or just to experience something new, or because they thought that this would be therapeutic, etc. But when this no comes from those I think have an intrinsic attitude and some level of skill and potential, I do ask them, why? Why did you not enjoy the course? Did you not find the course relevant or interesting or engaging? Why didn't you drop out of the course when you had many choices and the option to drop out almost halfway through the course? And often they say, no, it's nothing of that, professor. It's simply that it doesn't seem financially sustainable, or because our parents want us to do far more logical things, which is to sit for job placements for IT, consultancy, and finance-related firms. Now, what I totally respect and understand their choices and circumstances. Not everyone wants to be an artist, a visual practitioner, a curator, a historian, an art educator, writer, manager, or any of these things. And this is definitely not the point. What I don't understand is what is making this generation of young, educated, informed, bright minds to base important decisions of their life largely on economics. Why should something as important as our profession, our work, our long-term interests, all of these aspects that play an important role in shaping and defining who we are and what we aspire to achieve be quantified, calibrated, and evaluated in terms of how it will impact our purchasing power? Surely there is a pattern to this kind of thinking, one in which the connection between sustainability and the social dimensions of our life are not acknowledged. To see if I can get a different response, hopefully a more positive one, I tweak my question around to ask, okay, so do you think your ability to read an image, whether it's a drawing, a painting, a print, a photograph, a sculpture, installation, textile work, digital art, or new media, whatever it has to be, has offered you a more humane understanding of the world that will help to reshape your research ideas and methodology in some way? And this time around, I get a loud and clear yes in reply. The point I want to derive from this social experiment is that if we simply change the way we approach the same set of dots on the grid, the pattern can change drastically. Just like there is a practice of column, and just like in column, where we can create different patterns with the same number of dots on the grid, depending on how we can join or loop the dots. Now let me try to explain this with some visual references. I don't know if you are able to see the images on the screen. I've shared them from my laptop. So if you can see the images, what you see here is a pattern drawn on the floor at a very precise location, which is the threshold of a house at a village called Selimaju in the Puducherry district of Tamil Nadu in India. Now, what this pattern and many such similar ones are made as an everyday ritual by Tamil women. This practice is called kolam. The word kolam literally translates to form or beauty in Tamil. Interestingly, the basis of these patterns is a grid of dots known as pulli, and there are two broad categories of kolams. One in which the lines loop around the dots, and the other in which the second in which the lines connect the dots. And this is the second slide for that. So the image on the left is the one in which the lines join the dots, and the image on the right is the one in which the lines are looped around the dots. So scholars have identified that kolam consists of 6 categories of mathematical skills, including counting, locating, measuring, designing, playing, and explaining. Another interesting aspect is that the medium used here is rice, either as dry flour or as wet paste. Rice being the staple food of this region is readily available in every household and has cultural and spiritual relevance as a symbol of auspiciousness, abundance, and fertility. These ephemeral patterns are made at dawn before sunrise and are meant as an offering to ants, birds, and insects, and are often eaten away and wiped under the feet of people stepping in and out of the house. Now let us look at these patterns which I generated on a metal plate when sand particles oscillate at different sound frequencies. These patterns are known as Chladni patterns, and they are after the name of Ernest Chladni, the German physicist, mathematician, and musician who in the late 18th century devised a way to visualize the patterns of vibrating plates. By simply looking at these images, I speculate some kind of correlation between these acoustic patterns and the kolam motif. Whether or not this may be the case is a matter of research, something that is outside the scope of this talk. But the question here is, what have all these patterns got to do with visual arts? I would say the same thing, that it depends on how you approach it. If I take a set of whole numbers and plot them on a grid that is spiraling outwards starting from 0, 1, and onwards, what I get here is a pattern which looks like something like this. But if I could also get a pattern like the second one, the pattern on the right, if arrange them on a regular rectangular grid that is spiraling outwards starting with 1, and then selectively highlight the prime numbers instead. Now what I can also do is I can do something like this, which is to write natural numbers on a regular square grid, and square grid which is spiraling outwards starting from 1, and I get what is popularly known as the Ulam spiral. Now, this construction was first made by Polish-American mathematician Stanislaw Ulam in 1963 while doodling during a boring talk at a scientific meeting. While drawing a grid of lines, he decided to number the intersections according to a spiral pattern and then began circling the numbers in the spiral that were primes. What he began to notice is that the primes form interesting diagonals. Now, if I arrange the squares of numbers starting from 1 on a straight line, which is what you see in the diagram on the right, which means I get a list of numbers that start from 1 and go on, like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, and likewise. And then if I connect them through an Archimedean spiral, distributing the rest of the in-between numbers evenly throughout, and then highlight the prime numbers, I get a pattern like this, which is known as a Sachs spiral. This is actually a variant of the Ulam spiral and was devised by Robert Sachs in 1994. And when all of these inspirations come into my studio, this is what happens then. Now, here, if you look, what you would find is that except for the scale of the work, everything else usually remains minimal. With the use of limited set of pigments, brushes, and some basic tools like compass, protractor, etc., I've gradually developed a process of working wherein I try to find a correlation between patterns in nature and those based on numeric sequences, algorithmic and trigonometric equations. These lead to drawings that involve an interplay of geometrical shapes, ratios, and fractals that allow for optical illusions. And once the drawings are transferred to the canvas, the stage is now set for the painting to emerge. The spirals appear in most of my work, symbolizing a way of sequencing, arranging, and organizing a large volume of dots into intersecting pathways. It's a conceptual tool for me to reimagine the wave-particle duality of quantum physics. The slow process of carefully encircling the dots and then filling in the negative in-between space with just one pigment allows me to have a personal and a spiritual understanding of time, one that cannot be explained in words. To maintain a defined geometrical shape and create an illusion of movement, each dot has to be in perfect alignment with those around it. Which means that if there is a dot which is placed in front of it, at the back of it, on the side, and along the diagonals, they all have to be aligned. However, no matter how much planned each step is, there is something else that always happens, and that is the most spectacular aspect of it. The world of mathematics has been an area of interest for several artists across different time periods, and the spiral in particular has equally been a motive that has intrigued many, including Louise Bourgeois, for whom the spiral was a central and recurring motif, one that she investigated across various mediums, including drawings, paintings, prints, sculptures, and installations. She said the spiral is an attempt at controlling the chaos. It has two directions. Where do you place yourself, at the periphery or at the vortex? Beginning at the outside is the fear of losing control. The winding is in the tightening, a retreat, a compacting to the point of disappearance. Beginning at the center is affirmation. The move towards the representation of giving and giving up control, of trust, positive energy, and of life itself. If you look at the colorful paintings of pioneering abstractionist Hilma af Klint, the spiral becomes a symbol of spiritual evolution and development. Af Klint's notebooks explain that the spiral, like a snail shell, symbolized the universe and the continuous process of spiritual growth. For her, the smallest element could be a reflection of the largest. And I can go on with this long list of artists whose works demonstrate a fascination with the spirals. But the question, however, here is, what is the connection between sustainability and the practice of these artists? My answer to this would be that, like any beautiful relationship, the connections between sustainability and art unfolds in subtle ways. More than anything else, painting offers us a space to pause. It allows us to process our thoughts and emotions and align them with experiences that are beyond our physical selves. And that, for me itself, is a very important process of sustaining ourselves through the challenges that life throws at us. The paradox for me is the more freer way in which I think and I try to explain my work, the more problematic it becomes for those, for art journalists, gallerists, and everybody else who is involved in the business of art. And so one of the biggest challenges now for contemporary artists today would be to make a switch towards ecologically friendly materials and methods as part of the practice. And I think one of the ways we could achieve this effectively would be to revive age-old knowledge of using dyes extracted from plants, roots, minerals, as well as traditionally used in many art and craft traditions in different parts of the world, including India. And I would like to reflect on one such practice, that of the kalamkari, which is an ancient hand painting technique usually done on cotton or silk fabric with natural dyes and tamarind pen. And this is one of the works of a contemporary Indian artist called Lavanya Mani, who, what she does is she harnesses this technique of kalamkari, embroidery, tie and dye, applique, batik, and all of these different craft practices in conjunction with painting on cotton and hand-woven fabric. So, in conclusion, what I have to admit is that what I've shared here is just a micro, granular perspective of what I think is the larger picture, and it comes from a very subjective point of view. So this is definitely maybe not a kind of a reflection of what may be the case in other parts of the world, but hopefully I think it can concur with what we think is the need of the time, which is to think about creative practices in an integrated way and to think about them in confluence as not just as separate art practices, but those which are integral to meaning making and to production of knowledge itself. However, there are lots of problems with the current arts ecosystem, and the arts ecosystem apparently seems to be extremely dynamic, and it seems to be a very free happening space with the rise in the number of art fairs, biennials, and art shows and exhibitions that are taking place all over the world in different parts of the world, and initiated by galleries and museums of the world. It still remains a very fractured, fragmented, and a very opaque ecosystem, and there is a lot of need for transparency in all directions, whether it is in terms of pricing, in terms of the way the works, the sales take place, and the way the resale value of the work, in terms of ownership, in terms of copyright issues. All of these very complex things make it extremely difficult for artists to carve a path that is honest to their research interests and to the true direction that their practice should actually take, versus the direction they have to often take, because galleries are more interested in they taking up commission projects. So it's obviously a very tough negotiation, and even at the institutional level, where the department at Ashoka University, the visual arts department, is still very much a work in progress, and to be able to think of the studio as equivalent to a laboratory space, and the value of practice is equivalent to research, is also a very tough negotiation, because it doesn't usually, it's very difficult to quantify the importance of art and the ways that art education impacts young minds. So with that thought, I leave the floor open for discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing natural sciences together with art. Okay, so we opened up the discussion. Are there any questions or comments?
I will ask artist a challenging question. In technical field where I'm coming from, we use now AI, ChatGPT, to improve our reports, our papers. We just wrote a patent. We presented patent to ChatGPT. It improved the patent. Of course, the ideas are ours, but the patent did phenomenal claims. We showed to the lawyer said, these are better than my claim that I would write. What about art? Can you use or will you use AI in art? Before you answer, my opinion will be that AI will also help art, fortunately or unfortunately. And I have proofs for this. My students already created something with AI. They used a 3D printer, printed a beautiful sculpture, and now if we find a good artist, based on this sculpture, not only one, several, they can select the best one and create a real sculpture. Instead of Michelangelo or whatever, now we have a AI to create sculptures. Not only sculptures, pictures as well. We are using all kind of diagrams. Just recently, one of my papers, I wrote some diagram. It was really ugly. With a pencil, I presented, they call this in ChatGPT infographics. If you never use infographics, put any picture, anything, and ask, create for me infograph. ChatGPT created something phenomenal I put in my paper. All journals, technical journals, now allow that you use AI. Only you have to declare. I'm editor-chief of 2 Springer journals, and at the end you have to put in the paper, yes, I use AI, and you have to explain what, not to do any innovation. This is not allowed, but you can use it. My challenge to you, especially to Maja. Maja was against, she said we need to have always innovation in art and so on. I agree, but can you improve your book?
On the contrary, I was saying there, you were not listening, positive and negative aspects to everything new, and went back into history all the way to Socrates and Gutenberg to say that even at that time they were at first, they were resistance to anything new, and I ended up saying, and you were talking about art, I was talking about literature. You were talking about visual arts, I was talking about literature, and I ended up with a personal recent example of being asked by the president of the Academy of Ethics in India to write a blurb for his latest book, which I did, and then he tested it with Grok, the chat child of Elon Musk. I don't know, where were you? But anyway, I said, and then Grok said that I am really one of the sharpest minds and that he wouldn't be able to say something, you know, so I beat Grok, okay. So, that's all I can say as far as this. Of course, I'm talking in my book, Digital Galaxy, that had 4 editions. And I said in the beginning that I never had to add another word to it. Only the last chapter about artificial intelligence. And throughout this book, I was saying that there are always negative and positive aspects to any innovation, and that we should take advantage of artificial intelligence, which you just explained that you do with your students. So
No,
there
but
is,
I'm
but there is,
asking in
I am a
art,
poet,
how
number
you
one.
gonna use
So in poetry,
How are you going to use in poetry and in new books
I am
AI?
saying, and I'm experiencing something that is definitely the case. The case is, and I've been saying it in my speech, there are emotions and things that chats cannot do. And poetry wins. That's for sure, because in my own experience, when I would chat with chat, I saw that they are very knowledgeable, but very limited in their knowledge, at least in my opinion. And I can recognize their paintings, I can do it. And I can recognize their critiques of books, let's say, because they're full of very beautiful phrases and very limited deep analysis. That's what it is. And when I challenged it to analyze, say, who I am, it was again full of beautiful phrases. And so I see that there is lots of uses in what you call art. You were referring to visual art, but in art in general, including literature and critiques and theory and essays and poetry, all of it. But it's limited, and that gives us this incentive to
I still
be
don't
even
understand.
better.
Are you for or against using
Neither,
AI in
neither
art?
for nor against. I've been saying it from the beginning. You keep saying one thing, and I'm open to all. I see negative aspects. Again, let's repeat. I went back into history to see that all innovations were at first greeted with negative feelings. I went to Gutenberg, I went all the way to Socrates, and that's how it was. Written word was not well accepted. Gutenberg print was not well accepted at first, so we have experienced the
These
same.
are all things. Let's talk about AI. What about
I just
AI
did.
in your new
Okay,
book?
I just
Are you
did.
going to use
just
AI in your
did.
next
May I
book?
address something
This
you
is
said?
Okay,
You did say,
let's, maybe Vesna wants to say something.
Sorry, I raised my hand very early on because the question is very provocative. You said this morning, follow the money, so I'm going to follow the money for a moment. Last year, Atlantic Journal published a list of sources which AI used to train, or rather, the big companies used to train AI. And on that list of sources, all of my books are on it. So someone used my books to train AI, and I didn't get a pretty penny from that. The Society of Authors, which is our writers' union, and the American Society of Authors are fighting for us to get some money. So we're trying to follow the money retrospectively because no one asked us. Someone bought those books and trained, right? So that, I think, is incredibly unfair. However, now that the AI is fully trained, or perhaps not quite fully, is trained, my students do use AI. They have to declare how they used it before I grade their work. I have to have discussions with them because there is one thing which is using AI, which I use because it's more user-friendly than Google and more helpful when I write, but I also worry that it will replace me as a writer, not because it's not a question of whether it can be a better writer or worse writer than me. So it's not a question of quality. The question is that the sophistication of reading public broadly is declining, and people are reading popular fiction in greater and greater numbers, and literary fiction is dropping. So where we once sold 50 or 60,000 copies, we now sell 5 or 6,000, while people are reading airport paperbacks that could be written by very simple AI. So I'm not against AI, I can see it. The humanity is progressing, and we will have to change. Our trade is going to change. Someone this morning quoted Walter Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. For painters, it may be easier. If you reproduce a work, someone will still go to the museum to see it. But for writers, it's a whole different universe. So I think writers like myself will write books that will sell in fewer and fewer copies, that will earn less and less money, and we will have to depend on mentorship, either universities or institutions, if we are continue to create as individuals, as human beings.
if I could say something briefly. With my poetry hat on, I can't follow the money, there's no money to follow. What I can follow is the language, and it's interesting that you said that AI improves. You didn't say change, you said improve, so you've made an assumption there that AI can only improve what I do. I'm currently rather reluctant to give to AI just now the one thing that money can't buy, which is my experience of composition and creativity. I'm not yet ready to give that to a machine.
It's taking it from you, Mario, already, whether you want it or not.
No, in my
Because
private spaces,
but the books are out there. If you publish, they will use them to train AI.
Yeah.
So long as you're publishing,
But
it's
in my private study, I have my own experience of my own
Yeah,
creativity.
no, of
That
course.
is sacrosanct.
of course.
What is sacrosanct also, as I'm invited to various world poetry congresses and conferences and so on, I experienced in the last couple of years an absolute hunger in the world for poetry, believe it or not. I was invited to speak and to read my poetry in front of very big audiences. So there is this diametric clash of things that are happening on this planet. On one hand, there is the hunger. I go to India, I go to Tunisia, I go to Africa, I go, and there is this enormous audience for poetry. And I experienced that in New York, living in Manhattan. Allen Ginsberg started it, these slams, poetry slams, that are always very popular.
Let me just
To this day.
ask you.
And here in Serbia, I see also very young generation coming up with certain similar kind of gatherings of very young poets, and that are also crowded. So there are two things going on. And as a poet, I am very optimistic. As a novel writer, which also thinks more in monetary ways, I'm very concerned. Yes.
What would, again, additional question, because you didn't answer really the final question. Let's say you're an artist, you write, you're talking about poet or books, and you write one of the chapters and one of the song. What is wrong to put to AI and ask them different options of this? And then you see, you have your original, and you get 3, 4 different options. Of course, this is your part, your creation, but they may give you some additional things that look nicer. And why? You would like only your part, not somebody else's AI, which AI has behind this million data. In our case, in technical case, every part, my summary, my abstract, my conclusion, I put to GPT. This is my innovation, my work, but they find either better work or better format or something. Sometimes I like, sometimes I don't. What is wrong in art to do the same?
There is nothing wrong, and it's actually something that people do already. A friend of mine wrote 35 novels in the last 2 weeks with the help of AI, putting outlines, and the AI was producing whole novels. It's a detective series. It's actually very readable. What I was talking about is really something to do with consequences of that. So the equivalent to what I'm seeing would be if you put all of your products on the open access without selling them. There might be some joy in invention, but if your inventions weren't raising any money, there's a problem.
I think what's missed here is I often work in schools, and it's not about the quality of what the children create. They can create very mundane work, but we celebrate it. We celebrate the process. That's what we celebrate primarily. And I want to celebrate my process of creativity. If I want to enter into a collaboration with AI, I can choose that. But I do that very consciously, not as a matter of fact.
But unfortunately, the the world is changing now with AI. I understand.
The world is always changing. Always.
So,
And someone else? Yes, please. You can get.
The question here is, who owns artificial intelligence and what is the legal framework for all this? I think there is a gap there, a big question. So we are in an intermediate period, I think.
Absolutely,
Hopefully
that's that.
soon these questions will be answered. I think
Well,
it is
we will have
our
to-
duty to work towards.
We will have to sue AI, and AI will have to defend itself.
Also, I have to say, because there's nothing new under the sun, that in the 19th century, with the invention of photography, portrait painters thought they were going out of business, and then they created Impressionism and Expressionism, etc., etc. So, in fact, we will change our art, but we are now in the period when we are just being exploited. However we create, the end result is that we're being exploited as creators. The joy of classroom, etc., I agree with, but I'm used to making money from my work in order to enable me to create, and at the moment that is disappearing.
And that's why
I'm
the
not
question of ethics is
very fond of performing in public. If Maja is, then, maybe you could charge for tickets, but I prefer to stay in my study and sell.
Well, you're right now.
We have to remember here that most of the art we now regard as great was not created under economic duress. That's not to say it can't be and shouldn't be, but it was simply not created under economic duress. It was created from a different place of generosity and contribution often. We must not forget that.
Absolutely, but I don't feel generous towards AI industry. They could share some of their profits.
Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, good. So, yes, Mario asked me for a minute, another minute at the very
I
end.
apologise to my co-presenters. Something I forgot, because somebody asked me for this. They said to me in the break, how do we counter addiction? Well, the 12-step plan for alcoholics might apply to this, and I just wanted to share it. 1, admit you are an addict. 2, find hope. 3, surrender to a higher principle. 4, make a moral inventory of yourself or your organisation. 5, share with others and build community. 6, be ready for change. 7, seek humility. 8, make amends. 9, make direct amends, Pennington, direct amends. 10, take responsibility, not systemic blame. 11, make connection and build influence. And 12, carry the message into the world.
and 13, get drunk.
With or without AI? Can AI get drunk? It's not a companion in that, is it?
No. Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of this session.